Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session today on challenging the status quo, emerging Scottish publishers as platforms for diverse voices. My name is Mary Kidd, and I'm the head of Literature, Languages and Publishing at Creative Scotland. And for those of you who don't know us, we are effectively the equivalent of Arts Council England, north of the border, supporting artists, supporting screen and supporting creative industries. It's my very great pleasure today to introduce you to three really exciting publishers, all founders of their companies. I have Sam McDowell here from Charcoal Press, Laura Jones from 404 Inc. and Shan Azir from VHB. So what I'm going to do is kick off by asking Sam, first of all, to please give us a bit of an intro into what you do at Charcoal Press and really why you do it.
Okay, first of all, just a quick thank you to everybody for coming along today. Really appreciate you turning up. My name is Sam McDowell. I'm one of the founders of Charcoal Press. Our mission is to publish the best in Latin American literature in English for English readers. So we set out to go out and find out the best voices across Latin America that we possibly can. We translate the works and bring them here for readers in English. The reason we do this, and we set out to do this, is because we felt that there was a gap in the market to do. There was a lot of feedback there. Sorry. There was just a real lack of representation in voices from the Latin American region available to readers of English, and we really feel that readers in English are missing out, or have been missing out for a very long time, in the amount of access that they have. You can't hear me? Oh, sorry. Oh, hello. Wow, welcome. That's better. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback up here. I'm not going to start again. We publish Latin American literature. It's fantastic. The second thing that we do is we try and champion the role of the translator. For us, what translators do is absolutely critical in maintaining a global dialogue. So we are very careful to make sure that we give our translators billing on the jackets beside the authors. We try and hold events with our translators wherever possible. And we really try and make that role and that function, give it the importance that we see that it has in the publishing scene. We've only been going for a couple of years. Our first books were published in September of 2017. We've been very fortunate to receive a little bit of attention, some award nominations, etc. And probably the biggest one is that one of our first books, Die My Love by Ariana Harwicks, was longlisted for last year's Man Booker International, which was a pretty big deal for a brand new publisher. I don't know how long I can keep dining out on that, but I'm going to keep using it for a while yet. That's me for Charcoal Press.
Hello everyone, I'm Laura. I'm one half of 404 Inc. Is anybody aware of us? Hands. Okay, not bad. Shall I just skip this then, if you know? So I'm going to answer the two questions in one, because you asked why do we do what we do, because why we do it kind of was the reason that we started, and it was ultimately frustration. What reason to start a company than being frustrated and wanting to do things your own way? So that's exactly what we did. In mid-2016, myself and Heather McDade, we were working on for the Saltire Society on Scotlit Fest, which was a virtual literary festival. And so we were working with loads of publishers across Scotland, and we kept seeing really, really amazing books being published, but they're just not getting the coverage, they're just not getting the marketing that they deserve. And we were like, if we were a publisher, we would be pushing the fuck out of these books. So and we went, wait a minute, why don't we just actually do this? Let's put our money, the little money we have, where our mouths were. And that's what we did. So we launched with Nasty Women, which is what we're probably most known for. We kick-started that, and we got support from Margaret Atwood, which kind of threw us into the stratosphere, literally speaking. And then we got more backing from like Ali Smith since then, and it's like just funded our books as we've gone along. And we don't typically publish one kind of book. We just publish what we like and what we think is genuinely good, which goes from non-fiction to short stories to poetry most recently. And yeah, so we do it to keep it exciting. I think we've done a pretty good job of that, making sure our books look exciting and that they come across exciting and that they're just everywhere that we can get them. in the UK and hopefully internationally in future. And we were actually asked earlier today while we were sat in the Publishing Scotland booth, Dav from Booksource is a distributor in Glasgow. He actually asked, and are you still happy with the fact that you've done this? And we just looked at each other and were like, oh, that's a question. So I am reflecting on why we're doing this. And no, we are still happy that we're doing it because it is a hard slog being a tiny publisher, but I probably wouldn't want to be a tiny publisher anywhere else other than Scotland. So yeah, that's it as well.
Right.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sean Zier. I'm the publisher at VHB Comics. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Great, thank you. I'm not going to ask if you've heard of us or not. I'm just going to assume you haven't, because we make graphic novels and comics. So we kind of came out of, we kind of fell out of the small press scene. So in comics in Scotland and in the UK as a whole, there's, over the kind of course of the last kind of 10, probably like 7-10 years, there's been a real kind of drive of small press comics being made. So lots of small creators making their own self-published book. And that's kind of how I started. I decided one day, I'm going to make my own comic. So I did. And then I quickly realized that was a terrible idea and that my comic wasn't very good. But I was really enjoying the process of making. So kind of over the course of the kind of a few years, I was kind of still experimenting with like kind of floppy comics, the kind of comics that you see in a kind of American style. And then it wasn't until about sort of 2016 that we became a limited company, and I then decided to develop this kind of hybrid comic company / book company to really specialize in graphic novels, because we're currently Scotland's only specialized independent graphic novel publisher. There's no one else that does what we're doing. So to me, it seemed like there was a massive kind of gap in the market, especially in Scotland and in Glasgow in particular, where there's a real wealth of comic creators that are coming in, making their own stories, and then they are normally, what's happening is they're normally being exported or they're being hired out to American companies in the most. Which is great. People are making a name for themselves doing that. But what isn't happening is that there's not people being developed in our own kind of cultural kind of bubble that we can then begin to publish and then export. So really, the kind of the journey over the past kind of 2 years is for me, and the reason I'm doing what I'm doing is because my vision was that I want to be able to see graphic novels and comics read by a much broader spectrum of people. We don't make superhero comics. We're never going to make superhero comics because Americans do that very well, so let's just leave them to it. What we do make is we make some fantastical stuff. We make some YA-based books, and we also make some kind of feminist comics and books about seed change and about stories that people don't normally want to read, or most large publishers would never want to make. So there's a variety to what we kind of do, and a lot, much like 404 as well, is I'm making stuff that I want to see, and I'm making stuff that I want to read, because I think that's a good way to kind of go forward. But at this stage right now, we've realized one of our kind of goals, which was to be on the high street in the UK, which we did since April last year. So after the last London Book Fair, we managed to secure UK distribution to Waterstones in the high street and all that kind of stuff. And that's seen a good piece of growth for us. And one of my goals, because you have to always keep moving your goals, one of my goals was for us to be an export, and to export our work to the Americans. We're going to send you new books that you probably won't want to read, but we're going to send them to you anyway. So as of April this year, earlier in Frankfurt Book Fair, we signed with a US-based distributor to distribute into North America, including Canada, and our books for April will be in the States. So that's another little tick for now.
Brilliant,
Yeah.
Thank you all. Can I ask you guys, how many of you here are publishers? How many of you here have an ambition to be publishers? That's fantastic. Any authors or other book creators, translators, artists? That's fantastic. If I can start with you guys, the last group there, can I ask you all, what differs? We're here to talk about you as platforms for diverse voices. What differs in terms of your offer to authors, to book creators, and what do they mean in terms of your business? Could I start with you, Laura?
So like directly to authors, what we're doing for them? Yeah. I guess that's kind of twofold. With the boring logistics, we offer what is typically better royalties than bigger publishers. Because we can't offer huge advances, we think that authors should be getting more money than they're typically getting. I think we've all seen the Society of Authors survey that came out, yeah. When we started, we put that very much in the ethos at the very beginning that we were going to offer typically double the industry average of royalties. Because being early, we weren't going to sell that many, but then we ended up selling a lot and going, oh, okay, we see why this hurts us. But ultimately, that's a good thing. That's okay. If you sell more books, they'll be fine. So that's the logistical thing of what we do, I think, for our authors, so that we make it easier for them to actually earn from their work. And then on a more example-driven thing, Chris McQueer was our second author that we published after Nasty Women, and he is an incredibly hilarious, funny, I'm going to commit and call him a comedian. I don't think he'd call himself a comedian, but he has mastered the funny short story. And he comes from the East End of Glasgow, which typically gets a really bad rap. You'll only see it represented really negatively, like the scheme, and that's where all the crime happens, whereas it's the West End that's a bit fancier. And Chris just wanted to represent his Glasgow and what he has lived with. But not be kind of paraded, and it's not like a tokenist representation, which can happen with a very middle class industry, as publishing is. So we were very conscious of him just being represented as he is, him telling a story. The editing was very minimal, so it's technically written in Scots, like all the dialect, but it's very much just what he's familiar with. It's just his version. So we're very proud to keep true to that, and he has just kind of blown up across Scotland, which I think is very interesting. And so many people are coming to us and saying, oh, this is the first book I've read since I went to school, because I have no interest in books. They don't represent me, but this guy does. So that was almost an accident. We didn't set out to represent an underrepresented voice. We just realized as we were working with him, this is a missed opportunity generally in publishing, so we want to fill this niche, and that's definitely something that we look out for now, and we have that kind of driving our future list, I think. Yeah.
Can I ask you, is it your ambition to remain the publisher of your authors? It's often said that small presses almost function as launch pads, and authors typically will publish perhaps a success with a smaller publisher and move on, and obviously there's a commercial imperative there. Is it your ambition to retain those relationships and to build those authors?
Definitely, yeah, absolutely. With Chris, he's been from just releasing his debut and a second novel. He's now doing work with the BBC and working on his debut novel. Has a London agent, so we're totally aware that the day might come where he is taken away from us, and we're very aware of that. All we can do is just make sure the relationship we have with him is as good as it can be, and which being small and nimble, author care is quite essential. There's no hiding behind an assistant. We are the publisher, so if they have a complaint, it comes to us. We can't say, oh no, no, I didn't see that email. That doesn't fly. So yeah, we do our best to keep our authors happy and that they want to stay with us. I think we've done a pretty good job. I totally am aware that they might go. We see that because we publish a literary magazine as well, and we've had orders from large publishers who I know for sure are buying that and scouting for new talent so they can just steal it from us. And we're like, I see you. I'm going to charge you more because I know what you're doing. But that's part of the industry that we have to decide, whether we're okay with it or not. And I think we're just going to work as hard as we can with the authors we have now and not worry too much about that step until it happens, and then we'll have a fight, and that's fine.
Thank you. Shah, could I ask you to talk a bit about some of the proactive work you've done to diversify the voices available to your readership?
Yep. So I guess kind of one of the key things that we did or one of the key things I kind of identified over the course of the kind of past 2 years, when I first kind of got into book publishing, because I don't have a publishing background. I'm working class. I don't have a degree. So I'm a graphic designer and an illustrator and a museum educator for the past kind of 15 years. So going into publishing was not necessarily too far away, but it was an interesting barrier for me to physically overcome. First of all, in lots of kind of little ways, not just education and all those kind of things, but also quite often being the only brown person in the room, right? And that happens. It happens a lot. And I was at kind of one of the big publishing conferences in Scotland, and I was kind of looking. There was like 250, 300 people, and there were I think it was maybe 3 people or 4 people that were people of color. And in comics, particularly in Scotland, there's me and there's one other person that makes their own comics out of like hundreds of creators. So there's kind of all these different kind of barriers that are happening there. So one of the things I wanted to be able to do is by doing I think of VHB as a vehicle, right? So the vehicle is kind of moving along. It's got its own little ambition of we want to make nice books. We want to make interesting kind of content. We want people to buy the books and read the books. But then also alongside that, because I'm opening all these doors for the first time, it's like I want to keep the door open behind me as well, because I want to allow new people and new voices to be able to come through with us, right? And so part of that, and it's not like if I was a large company, this would be dead easy, right? But I'm a tiny company, so it's really, really hard. But it's also essential to have like seed voices and start planting those seeds of new people. So last year we ran a thing called the Full Colour Project, which we had funding from Creative Scotland to do, which was to basically work and mentor young people of colour, all based in Scotland, to get them to make their own comics writing or comics art for the very first time, and then publish that as a book, which is then, you can go to our stand and have a look at it. There's 14-year-olds in it, there's 26-year-olds, it's everything from kaijus falling in love to personal stories about wearing a hijab. So we were not restrictive in the kinds of content that was being made because we wanted to keep the barrier as open as possible. But like for us right now, making that one little book, my dream idea is that potentially in 4, 5, 6 years' time, those new voices might come back around. They might have finished college. They might have started experimenting, going into publishing, and then at some point they might be a new voice that 404 picks up down the line. And
going back to that idea of retaining authors, that's a very different model. That's essentially a talent incubator model.
Yeah.
And is that something you feel the ecosystem needs? Is that something you're confident in being a lead on?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's 2 different things there. What I don't want to do is like stop people from progressing. So I'm 100% like we need creative talent to come out of Scotland, and particularly in comics, to be making their content and put on a platform that we export, so that there's this understanding, confidence, belief that we can make stuff, and we are very good at making stuff. But also, what I don't do is like all our contracts with all of our authors, they can leave at pretty much any time within a 3-month period, right, of any of our contracts, and that's because we don't, again, we're not working as a traditional publisher. We're working as a comics hybrid, right? So pretty much most people in the UK, especially that work in comics, don't have agents. There's no agents, right? So we as a publisher have a kind of a duality. We actually essentially work as an agent as well as a publisher for them. So when it comes to selling the rights and selling the book and do all of that, we're doing that for them, all right? But we're also partners, 100% partners. So every single one of the books that we make, it's essential that we're because again we're tiny like 404, that we have to have a relationship with those creators, that we can work on a one-on-one basis, and that we understand that we don't have all the resources in the world. We can't just market your book. So they have to be able to do that with us. But I also encourage them to go and do their other works, to go and work for DC if you can get the opportunity, to go and work for Glenat if if that book comes around. you know, because ultimately it's good for their profile, it's good for our profile, and it hopefully ups our sales.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Sam, could I ask you, you're obviously operating in quite a different context, and there's that sort of traditional accepted wisdom that the UK market isn't so open to translation as it might be, but you're also, there are those obvious obstacles about promoting books when your authors are very far away and there's a cost implication, but I'm aware you're working really imaginatively with translators, so could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, there are a couple of points that these guys talked about which are also very important to us, that in terms of what we offer our authors, that I just wanted to touch on quickly. The first thing that any publisher of translated works offers an author is, whether we like it or not, bringing that author into English it's a huge thing. It's a very important step. It becomes a gateway language to other translations and other languages, etc. So it's a very important thing for our authors to have someone willing to translate them and bring them to English readership. The second thing that we then offer them is that we, again being small like these guys, we have a very I don't want to say intimate relationship, a very close relationship with our authors. They are allowed to be as involved or not as they choose with the process of the translation. They work very closely with our translators, some of which are here today. Oh, I found the right spot again. And some of them are very intrigued by it, they really want to get involved with it, and they find the process of the translation almost therapeutic and a reanalysis of their own work and their own styles. So that's very important. Although we're small, in terms of the commitment that we're trying to make to our authors, moving them forwards, of this, say for example, the first 5 titles that we launched in 2017, 3 of those already authors. We have the second titles in the pipelines with them, and we're continuing that with the works we brought out last year, and we will continue that as well. So for us, it's not just here's a good title, let's bring it to market. It's the start of a relationship that we want to build on, and it's important for the authors as well. Again, someone can come along and take them off us, offer more money, etc. We have to be aware of that, but whilst we have them with us, we try and look after them as best we can and maintain that relationship. That wasn't your actual question, though. What was your actual question again?
My actual question was really just about that, how you're using translators, how you're promoting their work, and how you're diversifying the idea of the authorship of a book that is in translation as something that a translator can also speak to. And I think you've got a new audience for that.
Yeah, exactly. I guess for us, we have to look at the fact that, and the reality of the fact is that our authors tend to live about as far away from the UK as you can possibly get. So getting them here is very difficult to do book launches, etc. So we try and also, where possible, do the events with translators. Sometimes we do the translator and the author as well. The objective is to really make it very clear that bringing this work to the readers of English is a very collaborative effort, and there's a lot of people who are putting a lot of effort in to make it happen. And we tend to look at almost like the history of storytelling, because there can be in the UK sometimes a bit of a fixation on the purity of the work, and if a work is translated, is it pure and is it as the author has intended? But we don't tend to agree with that so much. If you look at the history of storytelling in general, predates a written word. Stories used to be told by storytellers who would travel from town to town and make a living, and they're not telling that story the same each time. They're telling it in a way that was meaningful for them and allows them to convey the meaning to their audience. And it's the same when an author sits down to write a book. Even if they're writing it in English, they might start with an idea, they might wrestle with it, they might change it. What they end up with is not necessarily exactly what they started with. So for us, a translation is just another one of these creation processes that it goes through in the lifetime of this piece of work. And that's very much how we deal with it, and that's very much how we try and present it. Ideally, we want our books to be read by anyone. They're not for people that are interested in Latin American literature only. They're not for people that only want to read translated fiction. They're for everyone. They're great works by great authors, really interesting voices, and we think if someone picks it up and opens it and reads it and they say, I really enjoy this piece of work, I really enjoy this writing, they shouldn't have to care, and they probably don't care what language it was written in originally. They just know that this is a piece of work that they're really enjoying.
Fantastic. You kind of touched there, Sam, and I'll open this to all of you, as opposed to picking one of you. The idea then of what publishing diversely does in terms of access to new readerships. Laura, you mentioned people who've said this is the first book that I've ever read. My own background as a publisher involved working for Barrington Stoke, where we were accessing new readerships, individuals with dyslexia who struggled with reading. Do you find that opening up a more diverse approach to the voices that you're publishing is paying off in terms of a more diverse readership?
I've got a wee anecdote that I can jump in with.
Please do.
Whilst you guys think about your answers. It's interesting. It's always hard to know who you're reaching specifically, but there's one story here that we received one day, a handwritten letter from Australia. Somebody just wanted to thank us for bringing this book into English. This is Fireflies by Louis Sagasti, an Argentinian author. They enjoyed it so much, they found it that impressive that they sat down and wrote us a letter from Australia to say thank you. I didn't even know how they got it in Australia. I didn't even know our books were available there, but that's what happened. So that sort of thing is something that you want to put in a frame and put up on the wall, because that is, you're getting to somebody out there, you've touched them, and that's exactly what we want to do. In terms of trying to create new audiences or break down barriers, obviously we specifically want to take these works and make them more mainstream and make these authors more mainstream, because we believe they deserve that. We believe these works need to stand alongside works that were written originally in English by English-speaking authors, and we want to see that happen slowly by slowly. But that's what we're trying to achieve, and that little anecdote I think is a nice little. That's one thing where you can go to bed at night that one particular day and go, you know what, it's starting to work.
Yeah, I think for us, when we went into this, we had quite a clear vision of who our readers probably were likely going to be, probably younger, already somewhat engaged with the literary world. But what we have found with, again, to use Chris as an example, like I said, we've had on now numerous occasions people saying to us, if they hadn't ever even read a book for pleasure before, at least been since school, and they said, this is nothing like any of the books I read in school. I'm seeing myself in these stories. And I think when somebody tells you that as a publisher, you carry that excellent weight. That's good weight, but that's expectation of future, I think, to a certain extent. So like, okay, we've got people paying attention to us, or at least Chris, and we need to do justice to this. So it's very much at the forefront of our mind. But on the flip side, while Chris and the book is sold primarily, in a large way via social media. Social media is huge for us, and so a lot of our readership are on Twitter primarily. So, Chris is very good at punting it, constantly reminding people to buy the book. Oh, it's been a year since this book's been out. Isn't it a shame you don't have that book yet? And then we'll see sales come through on the website, and that's great. But most recently, we got a letter to the office, which always terrifies me because we don't put our office address anywhere publicly. So if we get posts from like an unknown, it's scary. But it was fine. It was a fan letter from a woman in her, I think she said she was in her 70s, and she said, I'm not on social media. I don't know how to get access to Chris. I know he's everywhere online somehow, but I just found this address on Company's House, and I thought, I'll just, hopefully you can get this to him. And she said the same thing. She said, I love this. You remind me of this author who I read decades ago. And it was such a joy to be able to pack that up again and send it to Chris. So the fact that he has a readership, I'm focusing on age diversity here, is incredible as well. So it's not just typically working class Scottish readers, and particularly it's usually the like men who will say, oh, I haven't enjoyed a book in years. And that's interesting as much as, women love Chris also because he's a bit of a pretty boy. He's quite, you should look him up. He's not a bad looking guy, I don't think. So that helps too. But yeah, getting slightly off track, the point is, I don't think you ever truly know what your readership is going to be. And while it's absolutely useful for your salespeople, they need to know the people you should be targeting. But if at any point that you hear that you're hitting a readership that you didn't anticipate, you need to pay attention to that and possibly nurture that for the future, I think.
Jack?
Yeah. So I think for us, it was there's kind of 2 or 3 things that kind of happened. So the first was when we set out to make our books, we were like, let's get anyone that doesn't read comics to read comics, because that's the only way we're going to be able to grow our audience. So we want to make books that could potentially appeal to that kind of cross market. So to those people that are in their like 20s and 30s and 40s who've been like, oh, you know what, I once read an Asterix, or I once read the Beano, or I used to read 2000 AD when I was a kid, and you're like, well, why did you stop reading? Come back, it's really good. So that was kind of one thing for us, and then in kind of in terms of, in ways in which we can like impact like change and impact like our audience. We did a project last year called Freedom Bound, which is a book about enslaved people and about it's part of the Runaway Slaves Project, which is run by the University of Glasgow. And so we worked in partnership with their American History Department to develop this graphic retelling of true history. And then we got to tell this amazing story, and then we got to pull that book together and do class sets of 30, which amounted to like 12,000 books, which meant that every high school in the whole of Scotland had a copy of that book, which meant that we, as the publisher, are then being read by 50,000 students this year as part of their syllabus, and potentially if they don't break the books, they will have a life for the next 5 or 6 years. And whether we probably won't still be in business by then, but they will still, that book will have a beautiful legacy. And one of the kind of advantages that we've got over kind of traditional publishers is that we also produce Glasgow Comic Con and as Scotland's kind of comic festival, and that's going into year 9 just now. So that's allowed me as a small press person to then being a publisher to actually watch our audience change and grow from our first event being a convention which had 90% guys over 40, middle class guys over 40, to then being an event which is predominantly kind of probably 60 or 70% are female. They're under 35. They're reading really, really diverse books. So we got to gauge off of our audience as well, our actual marketed audience, what kind of books they were reading and what kind of books they were picking up, so we could begin to kind of react to that a little bit. And actually, I had a letter the other day, which is really weird. Because I don't give anyone my address of our office either. And it was a chap who had come to Glasgow Comic Con in 2013 when it was at the CCA in Glasgow. And he had basically written his letter to say that he'd come to the event, he'd really enjoyed meeting lots of different creators. He knew that he had a story he wanted to tell, but he wasn't sure how or when he'd be able to do it. And then meeting all these new people and listening to authors and comic creators talk about their work inspired him, and he went immediately across the road to the cafe, started typing up this book, and then he now has published his novel, and he sent us a copy of that and gave us a thanks at the beginning of it, and that was really sweet. It was amazing.
That's brilliant. I think one of the lessons of today is definitely write to publishers and tell them if they've made a difference to you. Plenty of people write to tell you there's a typo on page 26 and you've got the history wrong. Not enough people write those letters. And could I ask you all, you've all got quite different and interesting ways of reaching market. You've mentioned social media, you've mentioned events that you yourselves run and events that you program with others. How have your experiences been with the general trade? In many cases, we could describe booksellers as gatekeepers. Have you seen support? Have you seen take up? And how has that experience been?
I think for me, it's because again, it's to the book market, we're still really new, and it's also understanding how comics works versus like how comic specialist stores work versus how high street stores work. So essentially, when we were making our books and we were trying to pitch them to comic stores through our distributor, it was a much harder sell because they are kind of really focused on like weekly comics. So it was like the new Superman, the new Batman, the new Spider-Man, what's next. and those comics only stay on the shelf for a week and then they're kind of gone. So, and also they're like, who are you? You're a tiny publisher. We don't want you in our store, right? So you never get any like shelf space or any shelf life at all. So it was only after we got high street publishing, high street distribution, that you know, lots and lots of independents and lots of, you know, Waterstones and all the rest of it had started buying our books, which is amazing. The public started buying them, so that's really nice. Thank you very much, public. And it's only then that comic stores are kind of coming back to us and kind of being like, oh, you've essentially been legitimized by being part of the book industry, so now we'll start buying your books and bringing them into our stores. So I have a mixed feeling towards those guys. I try to be as open as I can as possible, but it's still a big barrier. But there are, you know, Publishing Scotland run some great events which allow us to meet booksellers. And there's ReadPop actually who run this. They also run comic conventions. They have an industry day for comic publishing companies to meet comic sellers. So I've gone and done those kind of meet and greets, round tables. And it's nice that they're starting to hear who we are, and they're interested in our books. So it's you know, it's kind of like dating 600 people at once. Right, yeah.
Not in a good way.
Not in a good way. They all know you're cheating.
Yeah. The trade is tough. We, I think, made a very good decision right off the bat in that we partnered with InPress Books, and that gave us immediate sales and distribution representation across the UK and Ireland. So that gave us the presence or the means to be out there. We have some great relationships with a number of independent bookstores out there, but it is pretty hard to keep great relationships with 600 people at once. I can normally only manage one, maybe two at a time, personally. So then you have to find other ways. Social media we utilize because because we're very small. We don't have a huge amount of resources for marketing budgets. We don't have marketing people that can work for us. So we have to try and leverage social media as much as possible. And you know, we spend a lot of time chasing. We do spend a lot of time trying to chase getting reviews in the national papers or any papers, and it's really, really hard because you're fighting an uphill battle. You have more and more books being published every week here in the UK. The papers are all shrinking or going out of business. They have less space, less column inches every month for reviews, and it's tough to try and get some attention there. You keep trying because it's very important, and you have to try and get out there and in front of potential readers. But we are also at the same time looking as much as possible at reaching into you know, alternative means, trying to put more emphasis on bloggers. We try and work with contributors in Goodreads, etc. But the issue with those guys is that they can be very, very popular and very, very important, but they're avid readers and they're followed by other avid readers. So you also have to get out there to people who are a bit more casual, maybe aren't that serious about reading if you want to really get in there. And that's where these reviews come in. So there's a lot of challenges. So I think we made the right decision in terms of getting ourselves the vehicle to get out there across the UK and Ireland straight away. We're doing our best constantly to get the reviews. We're trying to leverage social media, and we're trying to speed date 600 independent booksellers and embrace Waterstones, but not too much at the same time. So yeah, no, it's not easy.
Laura, could I ask you, you know the theory that in any UK election, didn't vote would swing it. Didn't vote can be the biggest. Do we have a book trade equivalent where actually people who are not buying books are not being spoken to, and so they're not buying books, and that's continuing that sort of law of diminishing returns? We're talking to the same people, we're not opening our eyes to a wider readership. Is there any truth in that?
Can I have the other question, please? That's yeah, I guess so. I mean, I guess it does tie in initially like to Nasty Women for us. Crowdfunding that was kind of a step to get around trade and get around worrying about who about, okay, this book needs to be seen by these people, we need to get out there. With crowdfunding, you just put it out there and hope that the people you're aiming for will see it and that others will kind of come in there, if that makes sense. Because with that, we had a very we've had a totally back to front entrance into the trade. We're slightly like more legitimizing now. So we just had meetings with Waterstones and W.H. Smith for the first time. So we're like, whoa, we're actually talking to people. But we did say with Nasty Women, because we had to send out 1,200 copies, I think, and we had no distribution. That was just us. So we, luckily, Heather worked at Bright Red, which was is an educational publisher, and they had a warehouse, and they were like, hey, you can just hop into our warehouse. And we're like, really? You sure? You just want to store thousands of books for a publisher you have nothing to do with? And like, yeah, that's fine. They'll do with it. So we had to physically go in and pack the 1,200 packages and then send them out. You know, we had to drive to the post office like 4 times, and then the post office lady effectively banned us from going to that branch ever again because we were there for 4 hours and nobody else got served, so we actually can't go there again. That kind of said to us, right, there's a demand, maybe we need to be finding distribution. And luckily, talking about Waterstones, shout out to Angie, who is the Scottish buyer. She does incredible things, and for us has been supportive of us from the beginning. I think before Nasty Women was even it hadn't finished its crowdfunder. She was like, yeah, if you can get distribution, we can get in there. And we said we have this random warehouse, and she was like, that's enough. I can work around the paperwork and get you in shops, and she did. And so once you're in Waterstones, the other ones kind of tumble. I was still like physically walking into Lighthouse Books in Edinburgh with tote bags. You know all those tote bags that you're going to get? You keep those because you use those to carry your own books to the bookshops. And I had to do that kind of the case of like every week she was like putting in a new order, and I was like, oh, well, I just wanted a day off from walking to the other side of town. And luckily that became the fact that we were getting orders from foils randomly out of nowhere. And gradually the book started ending up in places that I don't know how they ended up there. I had to work backwards through a chain and see, okay, so who's sending this on? Like, you know, your book in Australia, how the hell are ours ending up in shops? Long story short, we did get distribution in the end, and everything's a bit more legit now. I think we had a totally back to front structure, but yeah, ultimately it's been, I think we're in a stronger place now, and that too does not answer your question in any way whatsoever, but it's too hard, so I'm passing it on to somebody else.
I was going to jump in. I thought it was an interesting question. Or not, apparently.
Shock mastering.
Yes, I think we do need to find ways to try and reach new audiences, new readers, not just for works in translation, but for all the works that these guys are doing as well. I think we have the same echo chamber type situation that I think you were referring to with in terms of the political discussions that go on. I think that exists in other areas, and I think literature is one of those, definitely. And it's just like I was saying, it's fine to for us to do stuff on social media, but if our social media followers are only people that are interested in literature and translation, then that's not really getting beyond them. If we are getting bloggers to write something about it, then that's great, but then it's only those people that are following them that are interested in what those bloggers have to say. That's why, unfortunately, the reviews in some of the broader papers are a bit more important, because I think you get a bit more of a scattergun effect across an audience. So I think it's very key. I think it's key to try and shake people out of their silos of what they're reading and what their experiences are. Don't just go back and reading the same books over and over again by the same authors, but try something new every now and then. I really recommend it, because people that do that with our books, for example, they always come back. They are amazed. They're amazed, and they also seem to think that they somehow have transcended to a new level because they just read a book by somebody in a different language. Some people think they can speak Spanish after they read our books, but it's not true.
Can I slide back in? I have an answer now.
Excellent.
Branding. That was something that when we started, it was like so important, and we wanted people to trust the 404 brand. But when they saw a book from 404, they thought, okay, even though I'm not into poetry, I'll give it a chance. And I think that's been the key thing for us because, like I said, we just published our first book of poetry this week past, and we were told, you know, it's kind of passed around knowledge that poetry is a hard sell, and you know, you're kind of put off doing it. But we were so convinced by the author that we're like, no, we're just going to experiment. And I think it's paying off because we're getting good sales from trade and directly. And it's completely different people. The people at that event are different from Chris's, are different from Nasty Women's, and then forgetting the people we don't know about. And I think that comes from us really prioritizing the branding and making sure everything has an identity, no matter how different they are. And that's the thing. I feel like people keep saying to us, and we keep checking, we keep kind of trying to ask people, do these make sense? Like, we lay out our books in front of them and say, can you see a thread? And they say, yeah, I don't think so. So I'm kind of trusting that unsure yes. I think that's something that publishers can absolutely do. I think it gets harder when you get bigger and you take on more books, but I think while you're small and nimble as we are, I think branding is a very strong thing, and that's absolutely something you have, obviously, across all the books have a unified look, which is beautiful, so you absolutely see one and you know you're probably going to enjoy the other one, and that can hit across so many different types of reader, and that's really important and quite exciting.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant. I think I'd like to give you guys the chance to open up the floor, so if anyone has any questions. Do we have a mic? I'm seeing my colleague nodding. I think we do. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to ask? Over here. Pass the mic.
Hi. Yeah, it's working. So I just wonder if you can fill in some of the holes in that financial sort of overview. I'm wondering specifically how much of what you do is possible or would not be possible without subsidies, without Creative Scotland funding, sort of non-commercial sources of income, and how much of that makes its way back to the authors above and beyond a 20% royalty. Are there advances and things like that, and the artists too?
I mean, I'll just start with us then. For us, it's quite, again, it's very different with comic creators. So a lot of comic creators already we don't tend to commission very much unless we have capital up front, or we have to find the finance to make a book. So sometimes making a graphic novel for us is a little bit how you make a small feature film, because we have to basically finance it from various sources to be able to pull it all together, because we're not paying one person. We're quite often paying 5 people, because we have the artist, we have the writer, we have the inker, we have the colorist, we have the letterer. Never always forget about the letterer. I'm so sorry, letterers. And as well as us as the editor and design kind of company. So there's a whole bunch of kind of things that kind of go on there. But ultimately, most books that we end up picking up, we're picking up existing small press books, so we don't have a big outlay apart from us financing the print and the marketing and all those kind of things that kind of come off the back of it. But the thing I kind of touched on earlier about us being partners with our creators is that we are partners, we're 50-50 partners. So unlike traditional publishing, all our creators, they get 50% royalty on all of our books, right across the board. Whether you're John Wagner, who created Judge Dredd, or whether you're Neil Lawrence, who just got his new book out, Dungeon Fund, for the first time. So everyone is on exactly the same deal, and it's a complete kind of fair, open source. Yeah.
I would have a slightly different sort of take on things. Producing translated fiction, there are obviously a few more costs and hurdles that we have to be jumped through to bring them to fruition. The process is longer. We have to outlay for the rights, we have to outlay for the translators' work, we have to go through all of this process, and it's maybe a year before we go to print, and then we have another few months before those books go out to the bookstores, and then they have 3 months to pay for those books, and then it goes on down the chain. So it can take a year to 18 months from the point that we start paying for a book before we start to actually see the first cent come back in on that, or the first penny, sorry, from country. So we have to bear that in mind, and then when that money's coming back in, you've started the next book and the next book. So you've already started outlaying on 2 more books. So you've got 3 books that you've started investing in before you start to see any returns on the first one. So support from agencies like Creative Scotland is absolutely critical in our case, in order to try and help us meet those sorts of challenges in terms of cash flow. But the vision that we have and the goal that we have is that it's a temporary thing. Our goal is to become self-sufficient as much as possible. And we could be self-sufficient actually if we output less books, but we're trying to do what we do in a manner that is significant, because if we put out 1 book a year, you still wouldn't have heard of us even 5 years from now. We have to be doing at a potential at a certain rate. So that sort of support is critical, but it's also actually, and I wanted to say, from a moral perspective, the moral support is absolutely amazing, because you started off down this path of doing something you don't really know, and you put your own money into it, your own savings, and you're hoping it's going to be successful. And when you have someone there that is saying, yeah, we actually believe in what you're trying to do, like cheering you along the side, it's hugely important morally, not just, from a moral support perspective, not just from a financial support perspective. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm reasonably confident to say that 404 Inc. wouldn't exist without Creative Scotland. Reasonably confident. Is that right? Yeah, I'm getting a nod from Heather there. She's like, yeah, that's about right. Creative Scotland were there for us from the very beginning. They helped funded our first literary magazine, which went on to Nasty Women, which then funded ourselves, and Creative Scotland have funded us. Just the other week, we were in New York. Like, they paid to send us to New York to go learn things and bring that knowledge back. I don't know how many institutions will give funding for that, so we're very grateful. And same for us. We are striving really hard to become at a point where we don't need to rely on that. I don't think we're quite relying, but it's certainly keeping us going. We'd have to probably publish less without Creative Scotland funding, and we would struggle. But in terms of finances in general, it's a tricky thing, and it's something that transparency is absent a lot of times. But when you're little, there has to be a lot of sharing of knowledge. And what we did recently, because I tend to be in control of the finances for us, I wrote a blog that gives all the numbers. I just put up all of our accounts online, so everybody can see, like, we made £15,000 profit in our first year, £11,000 profit. So it's going down, but our turnover is going up. So, you can interpret what you want from that. But so I recommend, if you're interested in the actual finances, go 404inc.com and find our blog, and like all of our numbers are there. Partly so I don't have to answer questions about things. I say just go read up.
I was also just going to add, it's a real ecosystem thing. You have to look at it from the point of view of an ecosystem. It's not just like some funding that helps us produce books. By enabling us to do what we're doing, it's enabling us to allow more translations to take place. It's allowing us to provide work to more translators. It's allowing us to bring authors that have never been available in this part of the world before to readers here. So it's allowing readers to have access to these new voices. None of this would exist without this sort of the starting point that you have with some funding. But it is important to not treat it as this is the way it must always be. It's important to treat it as a starting point.
Do we have any other questions? This one here.
Would you like to see the netbook agreement reinstated?
I briefed the First Minister in Scotland on that question the other day, so I'm going to pass it on to these guys.
I'm going to answer this with a non-answer, because I guess this is my first experience of the impact of not having the netbook agreement. When our very first books came out, it's a very exciting moment, as you can imagine. We launched 3 books simultaneously, and once they'd been printed and it had gone out to bookstores, I rushed down to my local bookstore. Well, it was a Blackwell's, and someone said, "Oh, your books are over here. They're brand new. They look fantastic." And they were sitting there, already labelled up with a 3 for 2. Okay, brand new books just come out, because they're paperback and because that's what they do. So we produce them in paperbacks first for a number of reasons, but that's our go-to format. We don't do hardbacks and then produce them later on. That is pretty heartbreaking, because you have to understand the discount that we have to offer through to that bookseller to enable them to immediately slash a third off the price so that they can put it on their 3 for 2 stand as a brand new book. Something's not right when that's happening. So that's, I'm going to leave my answer at that little anecdote.
No, I'm kind of the same. I think there might be room. I think there's room for discussion again. I think we can open up discussion. I don't necessarily think it needs to. It can't be the same as it was previously. Too much has changed. Too much is now dependent on audio and digital. That just wouldn't work for that. So I think, yeah, my get out answer is that we can. There's room to open up discussion again.
Something can be done.
We
need to find a better way.
Yeah.
Jimmy,
well, I think just to back that up, if I just give you a little example of like one of our average books. So an average book for us might retail at £10, so £9.99. So out of that £9.99, Waterstones get 50. Well, any bookseller gets a 50% discount, so they can buy the book for £5. Okay, so and our distributor will take normally kind of 12 to 15%. So after our initial, this is not cost for work, right? This is not including any work. This is just the cost of print, right? Our average book normally costs about £1.20 to £1.50, right? Let's be conservative and let's say it's £1.50, right? So after £1.50, we've basically normally got, once we've sold a book through a bookstore, we've got £2 or £1.50 left between us, split 50-50, and the creators. So for us to see our books kind of on sale at an even bigger discount, just so that those guys can do that, it's pretty galling, because basically the creators getting it's sometimes less than 10% of the value of their book versus what it's actually being sold for. We do a lot of shows where we work at comic conventions and we sell direct to market, so we are essentially booksellers ourselves. And as a publisher, that's my privilege to be able to sell my books at a better discount to encourage my sales so that my creators all get more money, basically. So, yeah, interesting.
Anybody else? Any prickly questions about how to reform legislation on the book trade?
Yeah.
Well, could I then, we're almost up for time, so could I finish up by asking you all quick fire, best lesson learned and what's next? Sean, could I start with you?
Best lesson learned. You just don't be frightened and just ask lots of. I never knew what a book list was. When I kept going to book parties and people going, oh yeah, my list is such and such. I had no idea as a non-publishing person what a list was. So just ask the questions. Like I didn't know what the net thing was a second ago, and I just asked Laura. So don't be embarrassed. It's fine. Life is too short for that. Next for us, we have Dungeon Fun, all ages amazing comic coming up. 144 pages coming out in May. We got Roll to One. D&D Adventure and Friendship coming out in August. We've got Plague Volume 3 launching at Edinburgh International Book Festival. We've Catopia Volume 2, Cyberpunk meets Giant Mechs coming out at the end of September.
Thank you.
Best lesson? Oh, there's so many lessons. I mean, the one that's been most forefront in my mind is don't ignore the finances. I mean, Christ, if you're like running a publisher, just don't do it. We're getting scary letters about tax investigations, and I'm like, I don't know what this means. So, biggest lesson, get an accountant. Yeah, it's very practical advice there. What we have coming up mostly is we're aiming to expand our reach across the UK for the next year. I think our biggest lead title of this year is Animals Eat Each Other by L. Nash, which was actually previously published in the US. It's our first novel, and we're putting a lot of money into it, basically, to be crass. We've employed FMCM to help us get that book out there. We're also just got Compass on board to help us with sales, so we're hoping that we'll together make that book grow and put our brand out there a little further than we currently are.
Fantastic. Sam?
Mine's easy. The very first time when we launched, we decided to launch with 5 books simultaneously. So we went through the process of acquiring, translating, preparing, typesetting, and printing 5 books simultaneously for launch. Don't do that. I beg you, please don't do that. Everyone told us don't do that. and then we held a couple back, but that was a hell of a lot of work, and yeah, I just don't do that. What do we have coming up this year? We have an exciting year. The next book up is actually the next book by Ariana Harwick's Feeble Minded. That's coming out in May. If anyone's read this one, it is equally potent. And then we have books coming from authors from Mexico, from Colombia, more from Argentina. So we're just going to carry on with that. This year we did our first title book from someone from Guatemala. We want to keep on pushing and pushing and pushing forward with what we're doing.
Brilliant. Well, here's to more diverse publishing, more books coming out of Scotland, and more brilliant titles from all of you guys. Thank you so much. Thank you to you all too. We're all here if you want to have a chat with us after.